Heart, wood from the Bo tree. By Buddhadasa Bhikkhu. The way to practice in order to abide with emptiness. From Heart, wood from the Bo tree, a collection of 3 talks given by Venerable Ajahn Buddhadasa to the Dhamma study group at Siriraj Hospital in Bangkok, in 1961. Taken from various postings in the Dhamma list at yahoogroups.com list, May-June 2001. In the previous talk I spoke of emptiness as being an important subject, but the occasion didn't permit me to give it the special attention necessary for a thorough understanding. So, as some aspects of this subject of emptiness remain obscure, today I have come to talk about it especially. Emptiness is the most difficult to understand of all the Buddhist teachings because it is their innermost heart. Being called a heart, it must obviously be something subtle and profound. Its understanding does not lie within the scope of mere conjecture or the sort of pondering that ordinary people are accustomed to. It can only be understood by determined study. The most essential meaning of the word study is of the unceasing, dedicated observation and investigation of whatever arises in the mind, be it pleasant or unpleasant. Only one familiar with observation of mind can really understand Dhamma. One who merely reads books cannot understand, and what's more, may even go astray. But one who tries to observe things going on in the mind and always takes that which is true in his or her mind as a standard has no way to get muddled. Such a person will be able to comprehend dukkha and the cessation of dukkha, and ultimately will understand Dhamma. Then if books are read, they will be understood well. From the moment of birth to the time of death we must train ourselves in this way, examining the contact of the mind with objects that surround it and the nature of the results of that contact. For in the natural process there will inevitably be both pleasure and pain, and observing them will make the mind wiser and more resilient. To keep observing that nature of our thoughts generates a mind emptied of dukkha, and so is the very best knowledge there is. Through it we gain familiarity with the realization or awareness of emptiness. Our spiritual disease is not a disease of the brain or nervous system, but is an illness affecting truth-discerning awareness, satipana, that which knows our life and the world as they truly are. So it refers to ignorance or the wrong understanding that springs from ignorance and causes the wrong actions that lead to dukkha, even if physically and mentally we are quite healthy. When we are suffering from spiritual disease, with what must we treat it? We must treat it with emptiness. What's more, emptiness, sunyata, is not only the cure for the disease but is also freedom from the disease. There is nothing beyond emptiness. The medicine which cures the disease is the knowledge and practice that gives birth to emptiness. When emptiness has appeared, it will be the cure of the disease, and after the recovery from the disease there will be nothing save emptiness. The state void of dukkha and void of the mental defilements that are the cause of dukkha. This emptiness, which has that wide breadth of meaning, is self-existent. Nothing can touch it, develop it, or improve it, or do anything to it. Thus it is a timeless state, for it knows neither birth nor death. Its being is not the same as the being of things which are born and die, but since we have no other word to use, we say that it has being characterized by immutable emptiness. If anyone realizes, that is to say, if anyone's mind realizes this thing, then it will be the medicine that cures the disease, a state timelessly empty. It is true health. Please keep trying to grasp the meaning of this word, or sunyata as it is in Pali, as I explain it point by point. Firstly, consider the point that the Buddha declared that every word that he, the Tathagata, one who is gone to suchness, spoke referred to the subject of emptiness. He spoke of no other matter, either directly or indirectly. Any talk unconnected with the subject of emptiness is not the speech of the Tathagata but of disciples of a later time who liked to speak at great length to show how clever and articulate they were. One can, if one wants to, add much more, for example, that emptiness is the absence of self or what belongs to a self, for the word emptiness has a whole host of applications. Although the characteristic of emptiness remains constant, its expressions are innumerable. That being so, we will aim to examine emptiness only as the absence of dukkha and the defilements that are the cause of dukkha, and as the absence of the feeling that there is a self, or that there are things which are the possessions of a self. This is emptiness as it relates to our practice of Dhamma. If we inquire which of the Buddha's utterances dealing with this matter can be taken as authoritative statements, we will find in many places the Buddha taught us to know how to look on the world as being empty. As in the phrase Suneto lokam avekhasu mogaraja sadasato, which means you should look on the world as being empty. If you can be always aware of the emptiness of the world, death will not find you. These words of the Buddha enjoining us to see the world as being empty show that it is the highest thing. Anyone who wants to be without problems concerning dukkha and death, should look on the world, i.e. on all things, as they truly are, namely as empty, neither I nor mine. The statements of the Buddha that follow on from this show the benefits. Nibbana Paranam Sunam and Nibbanam Paramam Suksam, which translate as Nibbana is the supreme emptiness and Nibbana is the supreme happiness. You must understand that Nibbana, the remainderless extinction of dukkha, means the same as supreme emptiness. And that it is possible to know and realize an emptiness that is not supreme, an emptiness that is in some way deficient or false. The truth-discerning awareness must be so impeccably clear that one has not the slightest feeling of self or belonging to a self for it to be called Paramam Sunam, supreme emptiness. Supreme emptiness is Nibbana because it completely extinguishes the things that are on fire, the stream or whirlpool of flowing and changing phenomena. Thus the supreme emptiness and the supreme extinction are one and the same thing. These words of the Buddha enjoining us to see the world as being empty show that it is the highest thing. Anyone who wants to be without problems concerning dukkha and death, should look on the world, i.e. on all things, as they truly are, namely as empty, neither I nor mine. The statements of the Buddha that follow on from this show the benefits. Nibbana Paranam Sunam and Nibbanam Paramam Suksam, which translate as Nibbana is the supreme emptiness and Nibbana is the supreme happiness. You must understand that Nibbana, the remainderless extinction of dukkha, means the same as supreme emptiness. And that it is possible to know and realize an emptiness that is not supreme, an emptiness that is in some way deficient or false. The truth-discerning awareness must be so impeccably clear that one has not the slightest feeling of self or belonging to a self for it to be called Paramam Sunam, supreme emptiness. Supreme emptiness is Nibbana because it completely extinguishes the things that are on fire, the stream or whirlpool of flowing and changing phenomena. Thus the supreme emptiness and the supreme extinction are one and the same thing. As for the saying that Nibbana is the supreme happiness, it is an expression in the language of relative truth. A sort of enticing propaganda in the language of the common man used because in general people are infatuated with happiness, they want nothing else. So it is necessary to tell them that Nibbana is happiness and what's more, is the supreme happiness. But truly speaking, Nibbana is greater than happiness, beyond it. It is emptiness. It can't be said to be either happiness or suffering because it lies beyond both the suffering and the happiness known by the common man. But when one speaks like this, people don't understand, and so it is said instead, in the language of the worldly, that it is ultimate happiness. This being so, when using the word happiness you must be careful to use it in its proper sense. It is not the happiness that people generally see or aspire to. It is a different sort of happiness, it is the state empty of every single thing that proliferates, flows, and changes. Thus it is truly lovely, truly refreshing and truly desirable. For if there is still flowing and changing, a constant swaying and rocking, how can there be happiness? Thus the feelings of pleasure arising from contact with the various sense objects are illusory, they are not ultimate happiness. The happiness of the common man is not the supreme happiness of Nibbana, that is emptiness. So in hearing the phrase Nibbana is the supreme happiness, don't go jumping to the conclusion that Nibbana is exactly what you are looking for and start dreaming about it without taking into consideration that it is also the supreme emptiness. The saying of the Buddha which deals with the practice in regards to emptiness is the one that is the heart of the Buddhist teachings. Sab Dhamma Nalam Abhinavizaya, which translates literally as no Dhamma whatsoever should be grasped at or clung to. If one amplifies the meaning a little, it may be rendered as no one should grasp or cling to anything as being I or mine. No one means that there are no exceptions, should grasp or cling means to give rise to ego consciousness. As being I refers to the feeling called ahamkara, the grasping at a non-existent soul or abiding ego entity. As being mine refers to the feeling called mamamkara, the grasping as phenomena as being connected to ego. So don't have ahamkara or mamamkara with regard to anything at all, starting from a worthless speck of dust up to valuable objects such as diamonds, sapphires, gems and the objects of sensual desire, and on to things higher than that. Dhamma, its theory, practice, and attainment, the path realization, their fruits and nibbana. Nothing whatsoever should be clung to as being I or mine. This is the heart of the Buddhist teachings and was affirmed to be so by the Buddha himself. So don't have ahamkara or mamamkara with regard to anything at all, starting from a worthless speck of dust up to valuable objects such as diamonds, sapphires, gems and the objects of sensual desire, and on to things higher than that. Dhamma, its theory, practice, and attainment, the path realization, their fruits and nibbana. Nothing whatsoever should be clung to as being I or mine. This is the heart of the Buddhist teachings and was affirmed to be so by the Buddha himself. He said that to have heard the phrase Sab Dhamma Nalam Abhinavizaya is to have heard every phrase of the teachings, to have put it into practice is to have done every practice. And to have reaped the fruits of that practice is to have reaped every fruit of the Buddhist teachings. So we don't have to be afraid that there is too much to understand. The Buddha made the comparison that the things he had realized were as many as all the leaves in the forest, but those which he had brought out to teach were a single handful. The single handful he was referring to was this principle of not grasping at or clinging to anything as self or as belonging to a self. To have heard this phrase is to have heard every phrase, because all subjects are condensed within it. Of all the things that the Buddha taught, there wasn't one that didn't deal with dukkha and the elimination of dukkha. Grasping and clinging are the cause of dukkha. When there is grasping and clinging, there is suffering. The practice is to make the non-arising of grasping and clinging final and permanent, so that the mind is unceasingly empty. Just that is enough. There is nothing else to do. This practice is every practice. Try to think if there's anything that remains to be practiced. At any moment that any person, whether it's Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones or anyone at all, has a mind that is free of grasping and clinging, what will there be present in their minds? Please think it over. We can take it step by step from the triple refuge to virtuous conduct, samadhi, and the discernment of truth, on to the path realizations, their fruits, and nibbana. At that moment they have reached the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. For to have a heart free of the mental defilements and dukkha is to be one with the heart of the triple gem. They have reached them without having to shout out Buddham Saranam Gacchami or any of the rest of it. Crying out Buddham Saranam Gacchami and so on is just a ritual ceremony of entrance and is an external matter. It doesn't penetrate to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in the heart. If at any moment any person at all has a mind empty of grasping at and clinging to I and mine, even if it is only for an instant, it means that the mind has realized emptiness. It is pure, radiant, and at peace. It is one and the same thing as the heart of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Thus at any moment that one has a mind empty in this way, one has taken refuge, one has reached the triple gem. If at any moment any person at all has a mind empty of grasping at and clinging to I and mine, even if it is only for an instant, it means that the mind has realized emptiness. It is pure, radiant, and at peace. It is one and the same thing as the heart of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Thus at any moment that one has a mind empty in this way, one has taken refuge, one has reached the triple gem. To move on to giving dana, alms, and making donations. The meaning of giving dana and donations is to relinquish, to end all grasping at and clinging to things as being I or mine. As for giving in order to receive a much greater reward, such as a tiny amount and asking for a mansion up in heaven, that's not giving, it's just a business deal. Giving must be without strings attached, a casting off of things that we grasp at and cling to as being I and mine. At the moment that one has a mind empty of ego consciousness, then one has made the supreme offering, for when even the self has been given up, what can there be left? When the I feeling has come to an end, then the mine feeling will vanish by itself. Thus at any moment that a person has a mind truly empty of self, when even the self has been completely relinquished, he or she has developed giving to its perfection. To move on to sila, virtuous conduct, one who has an empty mind, free of grasping at and clinging to a non-existent self, is one whose bodily and verbal actions are truly and perfectly virtuous. Any other sort of sila is just an up and down affair. We make resolutions to refrain from this and abstain from that, and then we can't keep them. It's an up and down affair because we don't know how to let go of self and the possessions of self right from the start. There being no freedom from self, there can be no real sila, or if there is, it is inconsistent. It is not aryakantasila, the virtuous conduct that is of contentment to the noble ones, it is worldly sila, continually up and down. It can never become transcendental sila. Whenever the mind is empty, even if it is only for a moment, or if it's for a day or a night or however long, for that length of time one has true sila. As for samadhi, an empty mind is the supreme samadhi, the supremely focused firmness of mind. The straining and striving sort of samadhi isn't the real thing, and the samadhi that aims at anything other than non-clinging to the five khandhas is miccha samadhi, wrong or perverted samadhi. You should be aware that there is both miccha samadhi and samma samadhi, right and correct samadhi. Only the mind that is empty of grasping at and clinging to I and mine can have the true and perfect stability of samma samadhi. One who has an empty mind has correct samadhi. Here we reach panna, the discernment of truth. It is clearly indicated that knowing or realizing emptiness, or being emptiness itself, is the supreme panna, because at the moment the mind is empty it is supremely keen and discerning. In contrast, when delusion and ignorance enter and envelope the mind, causing grasping at and clinging to things as self or possessions of self, then there is the supreme foolishness. If you think it over, you will easily see for yourself quite clearly that when these things have left the mind there can be no foolishness. When the mind is empty of foolishness, empty of I and mine, there is perfect knowing or panna. So the wise say that emptiness and panna, the discernment of truth, or satipana, truth discerning awareness, are one. It's not that they are two similar things, they are one and the same thing. True or perfect panna is emptiness, absence of the foolish clinging of delusion. Once the mind is rid of delusion it discovers its primal state, the true original mind, which is panna or truth discerning awareness. The word mind, citta, is being used here in a specific way. Don't confuse it with the 89 cittas or 121 cittas of the Abhidhamma. They are a different matter. That which we call original mind, the mind that is one with panna, refers to the mind that is empty of grasping at and clinging to self. Actually, this state shouldn't be called mind at all, it should be called emptiness, but since it has the property of knowing we call it mind. The various schools call it by various names, but strictly speaking it's enough to say that the true fundamental nature of mind is satipana. Truth discerning awareness, absence of grasping and clinging. Thus emptiness lies in perfect panna. If at any moment any person at all has a mind empty of grasping at and clinging to I and mine, even if it is only for an instant, it means that the mind has realized emptiness. It is pure, radiant, and at peace. It is one and the same thing as the heart of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Thus at any moment that one has a mind empty in this way, one has taken refuge, one has reached the triple gem. Now we are going on to the path realizations, their fruits, and nibbana. Here the progressively higher levels of emptiness reach their culmination in nibbana, which is called paramasanata or paramam sunama, supreme emptiness. So now you may see that right from taking refuge onto dana, sila, samadhi, and panna there is nothing other than emptiness, non-clinging to self. Even the path realizations, their fruits, and nibbana itself do not exceed emptiness, but are its highest, supreme level. Consequently, the Buddha declared that having heard this teaching is to have heard all the teachings, to have put it into practice is to have done all the practices. And to have reaped the fruits of that practice is to have reaped all fruits. The meaning of the word emptiness is an essential point that you must try to keep in mind. Now let us consider that all things are included in the word Dhamma. Dhamma means thing, Sab Dhamma means all things. You must be clear when you use the term all things as to what it signifies. All things must refer to absolutely everything without exception, whether worldly or spiritual, material or mental. Even if there was something outside of these categories, it would still be included in the term all things and would still be a Dhamma. So I would like you all to observe that. The worlds of material objects, i.e. all realms of material objects, are Dhammas. The mind that is aware of all worlds is a Dhamma. If the mind and the world come into contact, that contact is a Dhamma. Any result of that contact, whether it be feelings of love, hate, dislike or fear or satipana, the clear seeing of things as they truly are, these are all Dhammas. Right or wrong, good or bad, they are all Dhammas. If satipana gives rise to various interior knowledges, those knowledges are Dhammas. If those knowledges lead to the practice of sila, samadhi, and panna or any other type of practice, that practice is a Dhamma. The results of practice, abbreviated as the path realizations, their fruits, and nibbana, even these are Dhammas. To sum up, all things are Dhammas. Dhamma encompasses everything from the truly peripheral, the world of material objects, up to the results of Dhamma practice, the path realizations, their fruits, and nibbana. Seeing each of these things clearly is called seeing all things, and regarding all things the Buddha taught that none whatsoever should be grasped at or clung to. This body cannot be grasped at or clung to. Even more so the mind, it is even a greater illusion. Thus the Buddha said that if one is determined to cling to something as self, it would be better to cling to body because it changes more slowly. It is not as deceptive as the mind, that which we call namadhamma. Mind here does not refer to the mind previously spoken of as being one and the same thing as emptiness, but to mentality, the mind known by ordinary people. The contact between the mind and the world results in various feelings of love, hate, anger and so on. These are Dhammas which are even less to be grasped at or clung to than the Dhammas of form because they are illusions, born of an illusion rising in the realm of defilements. Grasping and clinging to them is extremely dangerous. The Buddha taught that even truth-discerning awareness should not be grasped at or clung to because it is merely a part of nature. Attaching to it will give rise to fresh delusion. There will be a person who has truth-discerning awareness, there will be my truth-discerning awareness. Due to this attachment the mind will be weighed down with grasping and clinging, and lurch about in accordance with the changes that these things undergo. Then there will be dukkha. Knowledge should be looked upon as simply knowledge. If one deludedly grasps it or clings to it, it will give rise to the various kinds of attachments to rites and rituals, samyojana, and one will experience dukkha without realizing why. Practicing Dhamma is similar, it's just practice. It is a truth of nature that results always arise in proportion to the practice done. If one grasps it or clings to it as being I or mine, then one falls into more error, creates another spurious self. And experiences dukkha no differently than if one were clinging to something as gross as sexual desire. Reaching the path realizations, their fruits, and nibbana. They are Dhammas, parts of nature that are such as they are. Even emptiness is part of nature. If one grasps at it or clings to it, then it is a false nibbana, a false emptiness, because nibbana, true emptiness, is ungraspable. Thus it may be said that on grasping at nibbana or emptiness one deviates from it immediately. All these examples demonstrate that there is absolutely nothing at all apart from Dhammas. The word Dhamma signifies nature. This interpretation is in line with the etymology of the word, for the word Dhamma means a thing which maintains itself. Dhammas are divided into two categories: those which flow and change and those that do not. Those that flow and change due to some generative force maintain their existence within that flow and change, i.e. they are the stream of transformation itself. That which being devoid of the necessary causal factors does not flow and change is nibbana or emptiness. It is able to maintain itself without change, i.e. it is the state of changelessness itself. But the sort of Dhamma which undergoes transformation and the sort that doesn't are both merely Dhammas, things which maintain themselves in certain states. So there is nothing more than nature, nothing more than the elements of nature, and how can mere Dhammas be I or mine? In this context, Dhammas means nature, the natural, or in other words, Dhammas are tathata, they are as they are, they can't be any other way. There are only Dhammas. All things are nothing but Dhammas. There are no Dhammas apart from all things. True Dhamma, no matter what part, topic, level, or kind, must be one with emptiness, completely void of self. Therefore we must look for emptiness in all things, or as we call them for short, Dhammas. To speak in terms of logic, all things equals Dhamma. All things equals emptiness. Dhammas equals emptiness. It can be put a number of ways, but the important point to understand is that there is nothing apart from our empty nature. Nothing whatsoever should be grasped at or clung to as being I or mine. So from this it can be clearly seen that emptiness is the nature of things. It is only by ending every kind of delusion that it can be discerned. To see emptiness there must be panna, that is undeluded and undefiled. There is a further category of dhammas, the dhammas of avidya, of false knowing, reactions arising from the contact of the mind with the world of materiality. As was said earlier, when the Dhamma which is mind comes into contact with the Dhamma which is materiality, a reaction takes place in the form of feeling. In regards to that feeling, one may follow either the path of avidya or of vidya, clear knowing. Its form will depend in the external conditions and the nature of that group of sankharas, dhammas. Thus it's just another Dhamma, a Dhamma of ignorance, the grasping and clinging to an illusory self and to things as belonging to self. Don't forget that it's just a Dhamma. Its true essence is emptiness. Avidya is emptiness just as much as are Vika or Nibbana. They are all equally Dhammas. If we look on them this way, we will see their emptiness of self continually. Dhammas of this level, even though they are one and the same thing as emptiness, may still result in avidya, may still cause the illusion of self to arise in consciousness. So we should be aware of the dhammas of grasping and clinging and ignorance, which are also included in the phrase all things. If we really know all things, this ignorant grasping and clinging won't take place. If we don't know them and just blindly follow our stupid and deluded animal instincts, it opens the doors to the dhammas of avidya over and over again. We who have grasping and clinging like an inheritance that has been passed down for an immeasurable time may see that from the moment of our birth we received training from those around us. Some intentional and some unintentional, solely in the ways of ignorance, solely in the ways of grasping at self and the belongings of self. Never once have we trained in the ways of selflessness. Children receive that sort of training. They are taught only in terms of self. Originally, at birth a child's mind doesn't have much sense of self, but it learns it from its environment. As soon as it opens its eyes or is conscious of anything, it is taught to cling to it as my father, my home, my food, and even the dish it eats from is mine, no one else can use it. This unplanned process, the arising of ego consciousness and its continual development and growth, follows its own laws. As for the contrary feeling of selflessness, it never arises. Thus by the time the child has grown up and aged, he is stuffed full of grasping and clinging and the mental defilements which are their cause. So that for him or her, ego is life, life is ego. When the instinct to clinging to self is ordinary life, that life is inseparable from dukkha. It is heavy and oppressive, entangling, constricting, smothering, piercing and burning, all symptoms of dukkha. When the instinct of clinging to self is ordinary life, that life is inseparable from dukkha. It is heavy and oppressive, entangling, constricting, smothering, piercing and burning, all symptoms of dukkha. So it follows that if there is grasping and clinging, even if it's to goodness, then that is dukkha. In this sense, that which is the world assumes to be goodness is false or evil. Goodness is still dukkha, it has the dukkha appropriate to it, because it's not empty, it's disturbed. Only when there is emptiness and one is beyond goodness can there be freedom from dukkha. Therefore the main principle of the Buddhist teachings, as elucidated in the phrase Sab Dhamma Nalam Abhinavijaya, is nothing other than the complete elimination of the grasping at or clinging to things as being self or as belonging to self. There is nothing beyond that. When we are completely identified with grasping, when we in grasping are truly just one thing, what can we do? Who can help the mind when it is in such a state? The answer to this question is again nothing else but mind. It's already been stated that there is nothing other than dhammas. Falseness is a dhamma, correctness is a dhamma, dukkha is a dhamma, the extinguishing of dukkha, the tool to remedy dukkha is a dhamma, the mind is a dhamma and the body is a dhamma. Therefore, there being nothing other than dhammas, the answer must lie in the mind itself, depending on a mechanism compatible to it. Whether there is merit or demerit is up to us. If contact with the world leads to truth-discerning awareness, then it is merit, punna. If contact with the world leads to an increase in foolishness and delusion, then it's demerit, papa. If we observe, we can see that everyone is born equal. Each and every one of us have eyes, ears, a nose, a tongue, a body, and mind, and outside each one of us there are forms, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile and mental objects. Every one of us has the opportunity to contact those things, and we all contact them in exactly the same way. So why is there this division between those who follow the path of foolishness, of demerit and harm, and those who follow the path of wisdom, of merit and benefit? There is a good side to it in the sense that these harmful dhammas are a real protection for people, on the principle that if we experience suffering we become chastened, we remember it. It's like the child who tries to take hold of the fire. Once it has seen the consequences, it is unlikely to do it again. With material things it is easy, but as for taking hold of the fire that is grasping and clinging, the fires of greed, aversion, and delusion, most of us aren't even aware that we're taking hold of the fire at all. On the contrary, we misguidedly believe them to be lovable and desirable, and so we are not chastened, we don't learn our lesson. There's only one remedy, and that is to be aware of the true nature of these dhammas. To know that these dhammas are a fire, that they cannot be grasped or clung to. This is to be on the path of truth-discerning awareness, learning one's lesson, remembering that whenever anything is grasped at as I or mine, fire is ignited. It is not a fire that burns the hand, but a fire that consumes the mind and heart. Sometimes it burns so deep that we aren't even aware that it's a fire at all, or that it is burning. And so we sink into the fiery mass that is Vatasamsara, the round of birth and death. It is the very hottest fire there is, hotter than an electric oven. If we don't look on things like a child who has tried to take hold of fire and refuses to do so again, it can be like that. Thus the Buddha explained that when the painful consequences of grasping and clinging are seen, the mind will relax its grip. So the question is, have we seen the painful consequences of grasping yet? If we haven't, then we haven't relaxed our grip, then we are not empty. On another occasion, the Buddha taught that whenever one sees emptiness, then one finds contentment in nibbana. Only when one begins to see the non-existence of self will mind learn to find contentment in the ayatana of nibbana. Anything which can be known through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, or mind is called an ayatana. Nibbana is called ayatana here because it is merely an object of knowledge. How can we be so foolish as not to see it? We will be able to know it from the moment that we see the state empty of self, because on the relaxation of grasping and clinging we will be content with the ayatana of nibbana. But it's difficult, for as I've said, our life is one of constant grasping and clinging, and when there is no abatement of that grasping there is no emptiness, and so no contentment with the ayatana of nibbana. We can see the truth of this point by taking a look at other religions. Other religions do not have the word atavadupadana, grasping and clinging to dhammas as being I or mine. Why is this so? It is because they teach a self to be grasped at and clung to. Not regarding such grasping as wrong, it becomes right, in fact it becomes the goal of the religion or sect. They teach the attainment of self. In the Buddhist teachings, however, atavadupadana is specified as a defilement, as foolishness and delusion, and the Buddhist practice lies in complete relinquishment. Consequently, the teaching of anatta is found only in Buddhism. Unlike the sects which teach a self to be grasped at or to be attained, we teach the complete destruction of self-consciousness so as to perceive the state of anatta, the state empty of self in all things. So anatta is talked about only by Buddhists. Knowledge and understanding can arise only in those people who have been taught that all things are anatta and should not be grasped at or clung to. If one is taught that there is a self that must be grasped at and clung to, then there is no way that one can practice to realize the non-existence of self. Thus we must examine the point that just as it is necessary to see the danger of fire in order to be afraid of being burnt, so also must we see the dangers of those things which are the root causes of all fires, the fires of greed, aversion, and delusion, of grasping and clinging. In order to become gradually bored with and averse to them, and be able to relax our grip on them without thought of lighting any more fires. Here we reach the word emptiness, of which it was said that having seen it one will find contentment in Nibbana. We must thoroughly understand that on the first level of emptiness is absence of the feeling of I and mine. If those feelings are still present, then the mind is not empty, it is disturbed by grasping and clinging. We will use these two words to help our memories. Empty meaning free of the feeling of self or that things belong to a self, and disturbed meaning confused, depressed, in turmoil with feeling I and mine. What are the characteristics of the state empty of ego consciousness? In the scriptures there is a teaching of the Buddha which lists 4 points. Na aham kavachini, feeling that there is nothing that is me. Na kasasi kinkanam kismin si. Without worry or doubt that anything might be me. This makes one pair. The second pair is, Na mama kavachini, feeling that there is nothing that is mine. Kismin si kinkanam nathi, without worry or doubt that anything might be mine. Ananjay sapaya sutta, mahihima nikaya. We are aware that there is nothing that is me, but sometimes there is a remainder of anxiety that there is something that is mine. We feel there is nothing that is mine, but we can't help doubting that there may in fact be something. There must be an absolute, unshakably clear awareness that there is nothing that is self and nothing that we need to worry about as possibly being self. There is nothing that belongs to self and nothing we need to keep worrying about or doubting or waiting for as being ours. At the moment that anyone's mind is freed from these 4 things, the Buddha held that to be emptiness. The commentary sums it up concisely as ne atanina, not taking things to be self, and na ataniyana, not taking things to belong to self. And that is sufficient. Try to imagine what it would be like for grasping consciousness not to be present. One doesn't look on anything anywhere as ever having been, as currently being, or as having the potential to be a self or belong to a self. There is no self in the present and no basis for anxiety regarding self in the past or future. The mind has realized emptiness through seeing clearly that there is nothing at all that can fulfill the meaning of the words self or belonging to self. All things are dhammas, simply parts of nature. This is the mind that is identical with emptiness. If we say that the mind has attained or realized emptiness, it leads some people to understand that the mind is one thing and emptiness another. To say that the mind comes to know emptiness is still not particularly correct. Please understand that if the mind was not one and the same thing as emptiness, there would be no way for emptiness to be known. The mind in its natural state is emptiness, it is an alien foolishness that enters and obstructs the vision of emptiness. Consequently, as soon as foolishness departs, the mind and emptiness are one. The mind then knows itself. It doesn't have to go anywhere else knowing objects, it holds to the knowing of emptiness. Knowing nothing other than the freedom from self and belonging to self. It is this emptiness that is the single highest teaching of the Buddha. So much so that in the Samyutta Nikaya the Buddha says that there are no words spoken by the Tathagata that are not concerned with sunnata. He says in that sutta that the most profound teaching is that which deals with emptiness, any other subject is superficial. Only the teaching of sunnata is so profound that there must be a Tathagata enlightened in the world for it to be taught. In another section of the Samyutta Nikaya the Buddha says that emptiness is the Dhamma that is always of the most benefit and support to lay people. There is the account, one that I have related many times in other places, of a group of wealthy lay people going to visit the Buddha and asking for Dhamma that would be of eternal benefit to householders. Those hampered by wife, husband, and children, wearers of sandalwood paste and perfumes. In reply the Buddha taught them this sutta, taught about sunnata. When they objected that it was too difficult, he came down only to the level of Sotapatayamka. The practice leading to stream entry to the stream that flows to Nibbana. Attainment of the first stage of holiness, i.e. the genuine realization of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and of Aryakantasila. The virtuous conduct that is of contentment to the noble ones. In fact, they were being lured into a trap by the Buddha and were neatly caught in the snare. To speak in coarse everyday terms, he completely swindled them. They said they didn't want sunnata, so the Buddha gave them instead something which could not escape it, the lasso that would pull them into it. For there is only one way to truly realize the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and to have the virtuous conduct that is of contentment to the noble ones. And that is to be continually seeing the futility of grasping and clinging. Now do you think the Buddha was wrong in saying that sunnata is a matter for lay people? If he was right, then these days we must be crazy, utterly wrong, because we believe that sunnata is not a matter for us householders, but is a matter for those who are going to Nibbana, wherever that is. That's how people talk. But the Buddha is talking in a different way, saying that this subject of sunnata is of direct benefit and welfare to lay people. So who is right and who is wrong? If the Buddha is right, then we must agree to investigate the truth of his words, and the way to do so is to examine which people have the most suffering and distress. Whose minds are most in the middle of the blast furnace? It's none other than lay people. That being so, who most needs something to extinguish that fire, to completely destroy dukkha in every aspect? Again, it is lay people. Those that are in the heat of the fire must look for the means of extinguishing it here in its midst. Because there is no place to struggle and escape to, everything is fire. Thus one must find the point of absolute coolness right here in the midst of the fire. That point is emptiness, the absence of self and belongings of self, sunnata. Lay people must try to discover sunnata and dwell within its sphere. If one is unable to live right at its central point, at the very least one should dwell within its sphere, have a reasonable knowledge of it. This then is counted to be of eternal benefit to lay people. This group of people asked what would be of eternal benefit to them, and the Buddha answered. Sunnatapada samayutta lokuttara dhamma. Dhammas endowed with sunnata transcend the world. To transcend the world is to transcend the fire. To be endowed with sunnata is to be empty of clinging to things as self or as belonging to self. So the saying Sunnatapada samayutta lokuttara dhamma is a gift from the Buddha directly to lay people. Please consider anew how necessary it is that one gives attention to this subject, and whether it is in fact the only subject that needs to be spoken of. In the Samyutta Nikaya it is clearly affirmed that sunnata is nibbana and that nibbana is sunnata, the freedom from defilements and dukkha. Therefore nibbana, too, is a fit subject for lay people. If lay people still don't know the meaning of nibbana, if they have not yet dwelt within its sphere, then they live in the midst of the fire more than any other group. The meaning of the word nibbana clearly extends to the absence of mental defilements, the causes of dukkha. So that any moment that our minds are empty of self and belonging to self, then that is nibbana. For example, at this moment as you sit here, I will attest that everyone, or almost everyone, has a mind empty of the feelings of I and mine, because there is nothing engendering them. In listening attentively you give no opportunity for self-consciousness to arise. So look and see whether or not the mind is empty of I and mine. If there is some emptiness, and I merely use the word some, it's not completely or unchangeably empty, then you are dwelling within the sphere of nibbana. Even though it is not absolute or perfect nibbana, it is nibbana just the same. Dhammas are of many meanings, levels, and stages. The nibbana dhamma lies in the mind of each one of you at the moment that you are to some degree empty of the feeling of I and mine. So please be aware of this egoless feeling, remember it well and keep it with you when you return to your home. Sometimes when you have arrived at home it will feel like you have entered someone else's house. Or doing some work at home you will feel like you are helping out with someone else's work, at someone else's home. This sort of feeling will increase more and more, and the dukkha that used to be associated with home and work will be no more. You will abide with a mind empty of self and belonging to a self at all times. This is to take nibbana or sunnata as the holy charm constantly hanging from our neck. It is a protection against every kind of suffering, danger, and ill fortune. It is the genuine holy charm of the Buddha, anything else is just a fake. Speaking to you like this you will soon be accusing me of giving you a big sales pitch. Don't think of me as someone hawking the wares of the Buddha in the marketplace. Think rather that we are all companions in dukkha, in birth, old age, sickness, and death, and that we are all disciples of the Buddha. If anything is spoken to stimulate interest, it is with good intentions. But if anyone has any truth-discerning awareness, they will be able to see for themselves without having to believe me. And that seeing will more and more open the way for further study towards the ultimate truth. If that is the case, then we must move out study onto the subject of dhatu, elements.